collaboration between VOA, the Voice of America, and Wion, World is One. We're joining you live from VOA studios in New York City. It's 8 in the morning, local time, 5:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. I'm Ira Mellman from VOA, Voice of America.
And I'm Palki Upadhyay from Wion, World is One. On Setting the Agenda today, we will discuss climate change and sustainable development.
We're experiencing the ill effects of global warming in our day-to-day lives. The world, at least much of the world, seems to have finally woken up to the reality of global warming. But are we doing enough to combat or to check it?
Well, at Wion, we constantly bring you reports on ice melts, rising sea levels, and every climate-related disaster. Today, we want to find practical solutions to this crisis. How do we cope with this climate emergency? How can we ensure that the situation does not get worse? How do we make our world leaders act? How can we, the global citizens, help? We'll discuss all of these in detail after this brief report.
We have banned the use of coal in energy production by 2029. The use of fossil oils in heating will end by 2030.
Now we have set ourselves a target of planting 10 billion trees in Pakistan in the next 5 years.
Συμφέρουσες για την Ελλάδα, συμφέρουσες για τη Γερμανία και εντάσσονται στο κοινό μας ενδιαφέρον να μπορέσουμε να αντιμετωπίσουμε ριζικά και ουσιαστικά το ζήτημα της κλιματικής αλλαγής και της μετάβασης σε μια οικονομία χαμηλών εκπομπών.
The time for talking is over. The world needs to act now.
Big words, big promises. But how much of these will actually materialize into action? China, which is the world's largest carbon emitter, lacked a clear roadmap for a greener tomorrow. The United States, which is number 2 in the list, chose to remain silent. President Donald Trump walked in mid-session, sat in the audience, and walked out after some time. Overall, the summit somehow failed to make a mark. Climate activists weren't convinced.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
The world is experiencing unprecedented weather conditions. There are record hot summers. The mercury is dipping to record lows in winters. There are flash floods. There are forest fires. Glaciers are melting. Sea levels are rising. And islands are disappearing. This is a climate emergency. Global warming is not a thing of the past. Global warming is here. This is our focus on setting the agenda tonight.
Xiye Bastida, she is a climate activist, one of the lead organizers of Fridays for Future. She's the recipient of the 2018 Spirit of the UN Award.
Also in the studio with us is Xiuhtezcatl. He's an environmental activist and a hip-hop artist, also the youth director of the Earth Guardians. Good morning to both of you and welcome to Setting the Agenda. I'm looking at the key takeaways from the UN Climate Summit. 77 countries have committed to cutting greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. 70 countries announcing that they will boost national action plans by 2020. 100 business leaders saying that they will take concrete steps to fight climate change. And France is saying that it will stop doing business with countries that do not follow with the Paris Agreement. Are you confident with the decisions that have been made? How do you see the outcome of this UN Climate Summit?
I've been attending United Nations climate summits since I was 12 years old, and I definitely feel a sense of urgency in this space. because of how climate change is so ubiquitous in our culture, more than it has really ever been. I think that's a massive combination between the urgency of the science, of the limited amount of time that we have left, in combination with the massive amount of social pressure coming from the young people mobilizing in the streets by the millions, the conversations that are being had within pop culture and mainstream culture, the acknowledgement that this is going to be one of the defining issues of our time. For us as a generation looking to these leaders, we are very keen to see these promises be followed up by tangible solutions and tangible action, everything from Copenhagen in 2009 to the Rio Plus 20 UN Summit in Brazil in 2012 to COP21 in Paris. I've seen time and time again these promises fall short, and so I think now we have an opportunity, and really we are in a moment where we can't afford for any of these promises to go unfulfilled if we want the future to look anything similar to as it does today, hopefully better, because things are really going to continue to get worse. Even net zero by 2050 still, I feel like we can reach further than that. But yeah, I think it's a matter of seeing how much of this is really actualized and brought into the reality.
So taking it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, I think so, and that's what I want to ask you, Xiye, and that is there a generational gap as far as you are concerned? You are two relatively young people, and you are among a huge movement that is pushing for mandatory climate change. However, there does seem, especially when we look at the United Nations and the age of many of the diplomats at the United Nations, is anything going to happen?
So, you know, the United Nations body is definitely older than we are, and the youth in the United Nations is 18 to 31. That's the age gap. And so anyone under 18, like most school strikers and organizers, don't even qualify as youth in the UN. And so how are we expecting to make our voices heard when there is no recognition of our age range? And so we saw this at the UN Youth Climate Summit, where, you know, you have two summits on the same topic. Why aren't you bringing the generations together? In our strikes for September 20th, we made an effort to make this strike intergenerational. We said the climate crisis is a generational issue because it's going to affect our generation the most. But that requires intergenerational cooperation because we cannot vote and make our voices heard in that way. And so we made sure that our strike was intergenerational to bring all sectors of society together. But when the United Nations, a body that is supposed to recognize these efforts, is not putting us in the same room with leaders, then we see a generational gap. And we do want to make our voices heard, and we do want to say, you know, this is about moral authority. We have the moral authority to be in the room.
Right. Generational gap is one thing. I think a political gap is another. I'm looking at a list of countries which have seen climate-related disasters in the past 1 week. Bermuda, Greece, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Spain, Thailand. It's across the world. And yet, we have leaders like President Bolsonaro of Brazil who refused help from outside when the Amazon rainforests were on fire. Do you believe that there has to be a political meeting ground as well for leaders to agree that they may need each other and countries may need each other to take decisive action against climate change?
So, you know, as a movement, we're all over the world. We are all over the country, all over the spectrum. And so we have to be bipartisan because climate change does affect everybody. But we do want political action. We are asking for political action, and when we strike, we say we vote next. Because it is a generational issue, and our generation is 100% of the future, we have to take our future into our own hands through our voting power, through that, taking that action. And countries should accept this help from around the world. And it is not okay that people's lives are being politicized. It is not okay that people's lives are, I don't agree with your point of view, so I'm going to let the Amazon burn. That is not okay.
I would just add to that, too, that in nations like the United States, where we do have the privilege of, from the age of 18 beginning to vote and democratically elect our leaders, we have an incredibly significant opportunity and responsibility to say that we are not going to stand to put anybody in a position of power that does not promise and have a concrete climate recovery, climate action plan to be implemented and put in place. And that's not just at a presidential level, but that's every level of power. We need people to be thinking, acting, and preparing for the climate crisis that is in existence today worldwide. statewide, anywhere that people have voting power to be able to elect and bring forth leaders into their nations, into their countries, into their cities, into their states. We have to reshape the political landscape by redefining what our expectations are going to be of the people that are representing our voices, and that means voting people into office that are going to represent strong, concrete action on climate change. And again, that has to and it really needs to fall on across the political spectrum. We need all people coming together.
I take it that's the answer as far as the United States is concerned in your minds, and that is with a seeming brick wall with the President of the United States when it comes to climate change. The only thing you're seeing is leadership change in the White House?
I think it's much deeper than that, and I think that when we look at the kind of change that our culture and our society needs to actually address this, it's about more than switching who's president, and it comes from a political place, but it also comes from the corporate sector and businesses playing their part in this movement. I think it also comes from a cultural change that comes from the bottom up, from individuals, families, everyday people that are also acknowledging and recognizing the part that they have to play within these movements, and how these different places are very connected. I think we have fed a false narrative for a long time that the only places that change can happen is in the UN, from politicians or from activists, and when in reality it's every one of us from every sector of society that has to play a part, whether we're journalists, teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, and I think breaking down those barriers and making people understand that this is about all of us is what will help kind of create more of that bridge.
So it's a new kind of communication, is that correct? What is the mode of communication besides digital media? Is that how you have to go about it, or what? And what's the plan?
I mean, one of the steps is definitely the media telling the truth, and I think we've heard this a lot. We are in a culture that lets you believe in climate change or not, and that is, as Greta said, in my country, it is a fact, and so how are we going to get to action when we're still debating whether it's real or not? And to the point of cultural change, even if we have a different precedent, if our culture is still an extractive culture, a culture that is not connected to nature, that doesn't care about the world as a whole, then we are not going to get anywhere either. And in order to change that culture, we need to change the narrative. And to show how climate change is affecting real people in real time. That comes from personal storytelling with data. When you tell personal stories and data, you are 22 times more likely to remember the data. And it's something that hits you in a different way. And so it does come from every sector of society, and it comes from what the media is saying. And right now we're getting an incredible momentum of media telling the truth and media talking about the climate crisis.
Right. Do you believe part of the challenge is also the fact that climate change is still a concept, an academic concept for most people? If you look at the figures, 102 countries in the first 6 months of this year were affected by climate-related disasters. But the enormity of the crisis is still lost on people, that they still see it as something that's happening somewhere else and to some other people. And sure, action needs to be taken, but it's not their problem.
Yeah, I think that gap that allows us to be desensitized to these things, that we are hearing the statistics, we are viewing the visuals, we are experiencing, and family members and friends of ours in different parts of the world, in different parts of the country are experiencing the disasters, and there's still a gap. But at the same time, I think if you look at, I think we have reached a tipping point in which there is people across the globe that are taking this more seriously than this conversation has ever been. In the political space, in the streets, like on social media, across the board, I think there is more of a conversation and an understanding that this is going to be absolutely pivotal in what shapes our future, because I think we're beginning to kind of break down what this crisis really means, which isn't just rising tides and drowning polar bears and melting ice caps, but it's really going to affect our economics. It's going to affect the kind of jobs that our generation is preparing for. It's going to affect our access to education, access to food quality and clean water. It's going to affect stability in different countries and immigration. All these different things. Our generation is growing up using technology as something that is giving us the ability to learn and understand many of these different issues. And we are very passionate across the spectrum, from racial justice to gender equality to immigration reform. Many of these different issues, I see it very much in the United States, and I think the most significant thing about the climate is that it is an umbrella that connects everything that we care about, and I think that is becoming more apparent, and that is what is beginning to shift people's ideology around it.
So we've established the situation and the problem. Let's talk solutions. When we're talking about countries, we say that they should diversify their energy sources, they should impose a carbon tax, they should ban diesel cars. What can businesses do to ensure sustainable solutions and sustainable growth, if you talk about specific, say, 5 action points?
So something that I hear a lot is that, I'm not going to implement solutions because solutions don't exist. And that is not true. Because we have the solutions. Go and read Drawdown, please. They have solutions from the agricultural sector, energy sector, business sector, educational sector. All across the board, these solutions have been created. And for businesses, we know that as consumers, from millennials to Gen Z, as consumers, we are going to know what we are buying. We are going to know that we are going to buy from businesses that are sustainable, that have, their clothing doesn't include plastic, that they have ethical ways of manufacturing. And because we're becoming more aware, I haven't bought clothes in 6 months, and all the clothes that I do buy are thrifted and cotton-based. And when that happens, then the whole system shifts, and what you eat shifts, and, just the way you even think about your daily life shifts because it's part of us now. It's not part of something that we are trying to do.
And I'll say that's a great point, too, because, I'm 19.
17.
17? Yeah, and the strategic implementable solutions and plans for reinventing a lot of these sectors of society that are dysfunctional, that are extractive-based, don't need to come from us. That is not our job to tell world leaders and politicians what the plans are, because that is what the world's top climate scientists, top economists are working to design, because this is a shift of not only how do we save the planet, but how do we enter into a new world where we can live in balance, where we can remember the ancient wisdom of indigenous peoples who have lived in balance with nature and humanity, and take that forward and balance that with the technological developments that are really defining our future. And it's like we can have a thriving economy and a thriving planet. Humanity can live in balance with the natural resources, and I think it's a question of whether there is going to be the willpower. Young people are pushing harder than ever to make sure that that is implemented, and businesses have an incredibly important role to play in that by transitioning their business models to be more regenerative and sustainable, by supporting these organizations that are doing the work on the grounds, and by saying, really identifying that the future that we are building has to be together. Governments, politicians, businesses and corporations, and individuals.
There is a problem when it comes to money. I'm sorry to bring up that topic, but nevertheless, there are countries around the world that are impoverished. And how can they afford to make the changes that are necessary?
I mean, one of the things is that you measure countries' wealth or richness with GDP, and GDP is not representative of what an actual country's wealth is. And we can see that in the US very clearly, where the wealth gap is enormous. And so when you measure a country's standard by how much money they have, how much they import or export, then there is something inherently wrong with how we measure things. And if you look at Bhutan, they measure their country with happiness. And so even if they're poor, they are happy and they are thriving and they're carbon negative. And so we have to redefine how society measures things. And money, we've been trading for thousands of years. Now we just have this thing in the middle that is money. And, even that is going to change. I know that our generation is going to start using, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And all of these things are going to break down the system in a different way. And the economics of climate, just in the most basic sense, it is much more expensive to address the climate crisis once it's already happened than to prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, talking about economic impacts from the climate crisis, studies are saying $600 trillion of climate damages in the next 80 years. That's double the amount of paper wealth that exists in the world today. 1 billion people displaced by climate change. The property damages are through the roof. So economically, it would be foolish to not invest and to put the energy resources into building the solutions today. Also, when we think about the solutions we need to implement, it is foolish and unholistic to bring forth plans and ideas that do not uplift and support the most marginalized and oppressed communities that are, first of all, they're contributing the least to the climate crisis, that are being impacted the worst. Black, brown, indigenous communities need to be at the forefront of not just being seen as the victims of this crisis and at the forefront of the story, but also at the forefront of receiving the benefits of transitioning our energy economy, of building green jobs, of creating, reinventing our agriculture system. So it has to be a holistic shift that does consider many of these impoverished nations need to be a part of this transition and the solution into a different world.
But there still is a gap as far as those who have and those who have not. The good news is that many corporations now are trying to help out. However, you still have, especially when it comes to countries like the United States, you have the upper wealth who don't want any changes. How do you reach them? And they're in power right now, so how do you reach them?
I mean, in the U.S., we see that things are not, I wouldn't characterize the U.S. as a wealthy country as a whole. Maybe it has a wealthy front. But if your front is wealthy and your body is not wealthy, then you're going to collapse eventually. And we need to shift people's mindsets into, it's not only about switching our energy resource and continuing with an economy that just wants to go up and up without a limit. If your goal is uncontrollable economic growth, that is another word for cancer, and cancer is unhealthy. And we are beginning to understand that. And when you shift what the body is, and if you go from a pyramid to a balance, then everything is going to change. And some people who love wealth and love power have to let go of that. And we know that our generation is going to grow up with that mindset, with a mindset of it's not only about switching our energy resource, but about switching our mindset into collaboration rather than competition. And we've been taught by society to be competitive, to be individualistic, to strive for personal success. And we know that that is not right. That has ended with Gen Z. Gen Z is the last letter of the alphabet. We are the last generation to be dependent on fossil fuels. We are the last generation to be individualistic, the last generation to be desensitized and disconnected. Everything is going to change, and we are bringing that change.
Right. We are bringing that change, but for some countries, the crisis is more immediate than others. Marshall Islands, the Maldives, countries like Jakarta, Indonesia, the capital is sinking. What are the immediate solutions that they can look at? And I understand your optimism about how things are going to change and how your generation is going to push for it, but it may be too late for some.
Oh, it is definitely too late for some. There are millions of people that are being displaced, that have already lost their lives, that have lost their homes, that have lost their connection to their ancestral homelands, to their culture, islands that are underwater, and it's crazy. In Paris, back in 2015, I was on a Skype interview with another media outlet, and on that interview was also, I think, the president of Kiribati, of an island nation in the South Pacific, and he was speaking and he said, for me and for my people, it is too late. For us, the damage and the impacts are already striking our community. We are having to relocate our population, our connection to our culture, to our land, to a place where our ancestors are from. It is too late. And we must continue to fight for everybody who is still here. And so there is definitely, the optimism, I think, isn't, the optimism, I think, is carrying a piece of hope that we have a responsibility to hold on to, because it is in honor of all the people who have lost their lives, their homes on the way, that we must continue to fight, that we must continue to hope that we have a path forward. Otherwise, it is, all these people have lost their lives and been in sacrifice so much for the struggle for nothing. And I've been in this for the last 13 years of my life. And I've sacrificed and given so much, and the struggle and the work must continue. I'm not saying that this is going to be easy, but we are saying that we have to believe that there is a path forward, and I think that hope comes from us believing that we can protect what we love.
We are running out of time, so very quickly, Xiye, how close are you to your goals?
I mean, the thing is that our whole goals they're all changed. Our goals are redefined. Before, my goal used to be a veterinarian. Now my goal is to save the planet. And so that is one thing, right? But definitely, I know what you mean. Our goals of going towards a sustainable, present, green economy, And you know, the United Nations was a big step. To have a climate summit is a big step. To have all these presidents from countries that are not doing enough is a big step. And we know that, you know, we got 4 million people in the street, and we're going to get more people in the street in our next global climate strike. And to see this shift in political conversation, to see this shift in international conversation is already a lot. But we need to keep pushing, and 2050 is too far for us.
Right.
Thank you. That's unfortunately all the time we have today. We can continue this. Palki?
Absolutely, and when we come back tomorrow, we will talk about the rising tensions between India and Pakistan, another issue that has dominated the United Nations General Assembly, a conflict that seems almost intractable. We'll discuss this at 5:30 p.m. IST and 8:30 a.m. EST, live from our New York studio tomorrow. This is Setting the Agenda. Thank you and goodbye.